Hello everyone, my name is Diego Medina and I'm a member of the Piro-Manso-Tiwa tribe in Las Cruces, and I'm also serving as our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Um, Alongside that work, I'm a full-time artist, and I'm also a museum worker as well. And so I do curatorial work and museum consultation, and currently I'm working on a full range of projects related to art and history here in the Borderlands region. So my cultural practice is pretty multifaceted, and my work as a tribal historic preservation officer is to ensure our cultural representation is accurate and adequate across the board, and also to maintain our historical and cultural integrity as a tribe. So working with the BLM, the National Park Service, and other government agencies in matters of cultural consideration, whether it be land use or resource use, museums telling our story, so on and so forth. So it's halfway between, cultural esoteric work and also political work in some regard, because you have to deal with politicians and other agencies sometimes. And a lot of the work I do as a TEPO is also directly tied into ecosystem and land preservation as it relates to our cultural homelands. So doing a lot of work to prevent development in certain sites, or to ensure that areas with cultural value aren't being mistreated or misused. And it's a role that requires a lot of tribal knowledge, both in our factual historical narrative, but also related to some of our spiritual practices as well. And so being a resource for tribal and community members who want to know more about some of our more internal cultural practices and what they mean, or who want to know more about our ceremonial calendar and how that relates to our cosmic knowledge and our ecosystem knowledge. And so it's a really fun role because I get to go back and forth between really immersing myself in cultural esoterica and cultural arcane teachings, but then also coming forward and interacting with other government agencies to ensure that our tribe's considerations are being heard and understood and met when it comes to how land is being used primarily. Aside from that, I'm an artist, and with my art practice, a lot of it is derived from the same sort of cultural knowledge I use as a TEPO, and so I'm really fascinated by the mystical experience of the borderlands as it relates to indigenous ways of knowing, and how ancestral wisdom is a transcendent practice that is applicable to how we understand our place in the world today. So using a lot of cultural knowledge to inform the imagery in the pieces that I create, and also just really emphasizing the use of magic in the ancestral tradition and how magic was an integral part of everyday life for our ancestors here in the borderlands. Because a lot of our cultural teachings are very, very multidimensional and utilize a lot of magical practices to honor the unseen forces that play a part in our daily lives. So, like I said, my cultural practice is very multifaceted and very diverse, but it also is tied together through these common themes of cultural knowledge. So in my work, I use a lot of landscape imagery as a character to really speak to this notion of landscape as ancestor and as guide, and how the land really is both a relative and a spiritual metaphor for how we are to conduct ourselves in this life, and how everything about the landscape and the ecosystem is speaking to us in a way that, in a didactic way, so that we can understand a little bit more about who we are and why we're here. And so really evoking that sense of spiritual presence in the landscape, and again, invoking the sense of magic that's inherent in all things, and how magic is kind of this glue that ties and holds everything together. And reality really is held together by magic and these unseen forces that our ancestors have always known about, and it's just as much a part of our lives as the forces we see and know. The foundation of all the work I do is the practice of prayer, and I think that prayer is really important to understand because it's the link that connects us all the way back to creation itself. And so when we think about prayer, we acknowledge those that come before us and how they prayed for us to be here and to have a place to be. And that prayer, of course, is an unbroken chain all the way back through time. And so by carrying forward the process of prayer through personal practice or through ceremony, it's a link all the way through time back to the past, to that first force that prayed for us to be here. And then similarly, it's a connection we have to the future and to our descendants of all types in the future who will be praying in the same way as well. So being a cultural practitioner and carrying on traditions of ceremonial significance is about creating a bridge through time that allows, again, transcendence to take place and allows us to be stewards of our past and of our futures as well as our present tense. And so being the best caretakers we can of all possible timelines so that the best future can unfold for those who are to come. My work as a tribal historic preservation officer obviously is tied directly to the past. And so in that regard, it's intergenerational because I'm dealing directly with the stories of my ancestors. And how they lived and existed, and how they allowed their spiritual practice in this landscape to be what allowed us to be here. So I think that for me, it's always present in my mind when I'm doing work that I'm connected to these forebears whose wisdom is with me, whose guidance is with me, and I honor them through the work that I do to ensure the integrity of our ecosystem is considered, and to ensure that our cultural lifeways can carry forward in this landscape, in our homelands, and making sure that our youth and our community and our tribe know a lot about our cultural teachings and why we do things the way we do, and how that's informed by generations of spiritual commitment to holistic ecosystem and integration. And when I say ecosystem, I of course mean the physical landscape and all of the beings that are part of it, but also the beings that we don't see as well that are part of the ecosystem, so the spiritual ecosystem. And again, those unseen forces that play a part in our lives. So the intergenerational component to my tribal historic preservation officer work is very at the front of everything that I do, at the forefront of everything that I do in that role. And as an artist as well, I think that I like to use prayer to travel back through time to kind of cull some more wisdom that comes from a time before, and use myself as a conduit to access those teachings that our ancestors had for us. And I know that in some form or another, there's a lot of wisdom that was left for us that we have the capacity to access through our practice of prayer and through ceremony. And so really using art as one of those means to bring forth that information and to teach a little bit about, again, the mystical experience of our connection to land and place, and how culture and how our cultural practices are the transcendent component within all of that. And so those are the doorways through which we can move through time and experience the lives of our ancestors and experience what they knew. And aside from that, I also do a lot of literal genealogical work as a Teppo, and so I'm constantly going through records and archives, aggregating data, looking at censuses, all sorts of stuff to put together the story of our people. And so as Teppo, I have, for lack of a better way of putting it, a bunch of stuff. I have so many papers and records, censuses, you name it, related to our tribal narrative here in the borderlands. And so I get to know our ancestors a little bit more intimately through that process as well, because I get to see these stories of their births and their marriages and where they're living and what they're doing here in the borderlands region. And to me, that's really rewarding work, because I'm able to not only know the story of my ancestors very, very well, but also help people in our tribe and outside of our tribe as well, who are from the area, know a little bit more about their ancestors and where they come from and who they are. And knowing a little bit about your ancestors helps make them closer to you. And so when you're connecting with them through prayer, you can visualize them in a way that allows them to be there with you, by knowing their names, their stories, and how they related to this place. And so for me, it's incredible work, and the intergenerational component to what I do is always present. The power of intergenerational work lies in its vastness. And I think that, a lot of times when we think about ancestors, people think maybe a couple generations back, or maybe even 10, 20 generations back, but ancestry is exponential. It's a logarithm that doesn't have a seeming beginning or an apparent end to it. And so I think that doing intergenerational work, yeah, of course, I get to know my grandparents and my recent ancestors intimately, but there's also this element of being connected to the force of creation itself. Because at the back of all of my ancestors, behind my human ancestors and my non-human ancestors, is that force of creation. And that's, the oldest wellspring from which I'm possible. And so intergenerational work is about being able to understand how vast you are as an individual, as a person, and how much you're actually connected to. And so, it's kind of like thinking about seeds in a way, and how there's this potential for infinite expansion from just one. And so everything inside of the belly of a gourd, in a way, is a really powerful way of looking at intergenerational knowledge, because you're able to be with the past, the present, and future all at once. And here at our old family house, it's kind of a powerful portal for transcendence, because it's one that my great grandfather built out of the literal earth below our feet. And it was an adobe house. It's an adobe house he built out of the earth here, and it's a living entity with us. And so it's a part of the land, and it's a part of our family history, and it's a place where all of my ancestors were born in this house and have lived in this house as part of our tribal land grant. And I get to come here and spend time with them. Because anytime you go somewhere, an ancestral site, you always have to realize that ancestral sites weren't meant to be ancestral. They were meant to be engaged with in the present. And where our ancestors breathe, in our cultural understanding, that energy is always there. And so when you go to any ancestral site, whether it's a petroglyph site or if it's a family home, you're there with their presence and with their prayers and with everything they brought with them. And there's always those through lines that connect you to that source of creation. And so when you're with your ancestors and when you're doing ancestral work, you're also with that powerful force of creation. And that's really the most empowering thing about intergenerational work, being able to know that you are connected to an infinite source of good. So, indigenous communities have a ceremonial relationship to their ecosystem. And for me, all of my work at its core is about protecting our ancestral homelands and our ecosystem so that we can maintain our ceremonial relationship. Our tribe obviously is from the borderlands region, and all of our cultural practices relate to the seasonality and the calendrical systems that are specific to how we conduct ourselves in this environment. And everything about our tribal structure is informed by our place in our ecosystem, and how we're caretakers of our landscape and of our home. And being a human is about being a caretaker. And so part of our role here as humans is to be prudent users of our consciousness, so that we can play our role in stewardship of our landscape, and have the necessary spiritual practices to add to our ecosystem. So everything that we do is, of course, part of all of the interconnectivity that happens in a landscape. So we're connected to all of the bugs and birds and plants that make up our ecosystem, and the way we live is us playing our part. And so our dances, our ceremonies, those are necessary roles we have to play in the balance of our ecosystem. So we're given a very important task in being spiritual caretakers of our ecosystem. And as a culture worker, someone who works for my tribe, I have to make sure that my mindset's right in everything I do. And so when I'm representing our tribe and when I'm working, doing consultation work, everything that I say and do has to be informed by that understanding of, I'm doing this for the landscape, so that we can continue to be a part of our ecosystem, and that we have a healthy ecosystem for the future, and not just for our tribe, but for everyone living in the area. And so making sure that the decisions we make are considering the future of our water, the future of our plants, the future of our soil health in this area. All of it is necessary so that we can keep surviving in this region. And there's also the other part of it too, which is that, the landscape is our spiritual advisor, and it's our spiritual accomplice as well. And so everything that we do with our spiritual practices, we utilize the landscape. We utilize plant materials and other relatives from the land so that we can conduct our ceremonies. And so we're in constant relationship with the landscape, and constant communication with the elements of the land. And so that's why all of the traditional art forms we do and all of the traditional materials we use come directly from the land, so that way they can be partners in ceremony with us, and that we can access their abilities and their power, so that we can do what we need to do as well. And that's really what ecosystem integration is all about. Everything you do is about your connection to your place, and how you're in this web of interrelationship that implicates everything living here. So everything you do, every action you make, needs to take into consideration the impacts it has on everything around you, and all the other living beings around. So a little more specifically, one thing I've been working on is reclaiming the practice of utilizing plant materials for or one thing specifically that I've been doing is reviving the use of plant materials for cultural art forms, things like yucca weaving and processing of various plant materials to make things of use. Yeah. So we're out here at Turtle Mountain in Las Cruces, which is one of our most important ceremonial sites, and it's been used for cultural and religious practices for thousands of years. And it's one of the most important mountains in Las Cruces because it's not only a cultural site but also a navigational marker as well. And so it has pointed the way for a lot of ancestral migration and travel. And out here, it's a really special place to be because you're in a site where your ancestors have prayed at and have done dances and ceremonies for a very long time. And it overlooks the Mesilla Valley, and so it's kind of this protective ancestor guarding the valley alongside the other mountains that triangulate Las Cruces. And let's see, what else do I need to say about this mountain? I guess that's all I want to say about the history of it. I don't need to go into anything beyond that. Look at some of the plants. And so right here we're looking at some local flora. And like I mentioned earlier, our relationship with our ecosystem and our environment is one of spiritual caretakership. And so knowing how to communicate with and utilize the plant materials for our ceremonial and spiritual practice is very important. For this plant in particular, this is used for making cordage out of. And so these pointy spears here are very fibrous, and on the inside you have these long strands of fiber that can be broken down and utilized to make yucca cordage out of. And that's a practice that's been done for thousands of years. And all types of yucca plant have their own specific use culturally for making materials that are needed to survive in this area, whether it's sandals, rope, medicine, food. All of these plants have multiple uses, and that's part of the beauty of being part of an ecosystem, is that every little part of you has its role to play, and you understand how everything fits together like a beautiful puzzle in an environment. Let's see, let me get some. And so you can see on the inside here how there's dozens of little strings, and those little strings are what you break down to use to make cordage out of. It's a pretty long process, a pretty labor-intensive process, but it's a worthwhile endeavor because you really get to know the plant intimately, and it impacts you in a way that is almost unspeakable. Getting to really understand the plant, asking to be part of the spiritual process and practice of ceremony, and getting to embody it and take on its qualities and characteristics for ceremony. It's a powerful relationship.